Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. Today I will be doing the It's Not Fall tag, which I was tagged to do by Pip Reed several months ago when the whole fall tag was going around, but us here in the southern hemisphere obviously have different seasons, so the It's Not Fall tag was a bit of a counter to that. But I've taken so long to get to doing the tag that it is actually autumn now, but I'm still going to do it anyway because it's not really fall. I mean, some of the leaves are turned brown and fallen off the trees, but they kind of just do that all the time anyway. So question number one is, where are you from? I think everyone will know by now that I am from Australia, specifically Perth in Western Australia. Fun fact, it is the same distance from Perth to Sydney as it is from London to Moscow. Second question is, name a book written by an author from your country. I'm just going to name an author who's my favourite Australian author, Robin Klein. She wrote children and young adult books from the 70s through to the 90s and was incredibly prolific. I think I've read all of her young adult novels. She wrote a lot of books for a lot younger children as well, but I absolutely love all of her novels. My favourites, as I mentioned before, is this trilogy about four sisters, all with red hair, living in Australia in the 1940s. But she's done almost every genre, from science fiction to horror. She's also written more general young adult fiction about children growing up, going to school, that kind of thing. So it's basically a Robin Klein book for everyone. Her most famous book is definitely Hating Alice and Ashley, and then also the Penny Pollard series, which started off with Penny Pollard's Diary, and is about this very exuberant girl who doesn't understand why the rest of the world thinks she's really annoying. I think the reason I love her books is because they are so Australian. It was so rare as a child to get books that really reflected the country that I lived in and the society that I grew up in, and they really do reflect that, even though they were written a few decades before I was even alive, some of them. And I absolutely love the humour in them. Robin Klein writes in a way where she's always very sympathetic with her characters, but she is also recognising the human fallibility in them. The third question is, name a classic from your country. For this I picked Seven Little Australians by Ethel Turner. This is probably the most sort of traditionally classic children's Australian book, and in fact the author wrote it after reading Little Women, sort of became inspired by the idea of a story about a family. So Seven Little Australians is about 7 children, all siblings. Their mother is dead and they have a stepmother who's very young and nice but doesn't quite know how to look after them all, and they have a father who is very strict. And the main character is a girl called Judy. She's one of the middle children and she is especially clever, so she's the one who gets them in all the scrapes. Unfortunately, the author also took inspiration from Beth's death in Little Women and decided to include her own death in it. I obviously love classics and I loved children's classics when I was a child, so I thought Seven Little Australians, which is written in the Edwardian era, was the best book ever. I haven't read it in a while, so I imagine reading it now there would be some problematic things due to the time that it's set. In essence, I think the story is still a good one, and I'm just always fascinated by stories about very large families because my own family is quite small. Fourth question, name a book from your country that you were forced to read at school. So I was homeschooled in primary school. I went to high school from year 9, and so most of the books that I was forced to read at school were quite good, really, because I did literature in year 11 and 12. But the one I remember distinctly hating was short stories by Henry Lawson. Henry Lawson is one of Australia's first well-known white authors. He was writing stories in the 1800s about people living in the bush, and he was mainly known because he was trying to write a very specifically Australian perspective and not just write English style books. One of his more famous characters was Joe Wilson, who was this everyday guy with a wife and a child living in the bush trying to get by, and I found them incredibly tedious. The writing style was really laborious and they're obviously really sexist, so I didn't enjoy studying them. The fifth question is, name a book that represents something that frustrates you about your culture or your country. For this I picked Tomorrow When the War Began by John Marsden, and this might be a bit of a controversial pick because the book is about an invasion of Australia, a group of teenage children who happen to be away camping in the bush when the invasion happens, so they don't get captured like the rest of their family and they fight back against the invasion. In the book, I don't think the race or the country that invades Australia is ever named. I'm not sure if it's implied that they are Asian, but it makes the most sense that an Asian country would invade Australia because they're the closest ones, and also the idea was that the invading country had run out of space. Australia's right there with all its empty deserts, so they thought they'd invade it and fill that up instead. I know that in the film adaptation and the recent TV adaptation that have been made of this book, they have specifically cast Asian people as the invaders, and I think that's the bit more that represents something from my country that I don't like, which is the prevailing idea of the Asian invasion. This was something that was especially highlighted during World War II, obviously, because of Australia being part of the fight against Japan during that time. But that idea, I think, continues to exist in Australia, even if it is under the surface. You've got the obvious example of Pauline Hanson, who is an incredibly right-wing politician that we have in this country, and she's known for saying back in the 90s that she thought Asians were going to invade our country. Her stance now is that Muslims are going to invade our country, but it's still the same story that she likes to tell. It's kind of crazy that we still consider ourselves as this sort of Western country closer to Britain and America, when geographically we are so much closer to Asia. And yet I think the idea that people from Asia are going to come to Australia and change our Western ways still exists, even though as a country we should be moving forward as the multicultural country that we are. But yeah, I guess that's my pick for that question. Number 6 is name a book with similar weather to your hometown. For this I picked My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell. This is set in Corfu, and Perth has a very Mediterranean climate, very dry, very warm, lots of limestone everywhere, very sandy as well. And in terms of gardening, Mediterranean style plants grow here well. I remember reading this book when I lived in the Blue Mountains, which is quite a different climate from Perth. It's a lot colder and a lot wetter. And I remember reading this on a very cold winter's day in one go as a way to escape from the very cold weather outside. And I think unconsciously it was reminding me of Perth as well. Number 7 is name a book with a cultural event that you feel like you miss out on. For this I picked Little Women. This book starts off at Christmas, and there are several Christmases mentioned throughout the book. Obviously in Australia we do celebrate Christmas, but our Christmas is in summer, and the prevailing cultural ideas around Christmas are still based in winter ideas, and people still even have really hot food like roast dinners on Christmas Day despite it being the middle of summer. And I've always wanted to know what it's like to have a cold Christmas. It also makes more sense to have Christmas in cold weather because the whole idea of the original Roman celebration around that time, which was called Saturnalia, which the Christians kind of just took as their own, was to have something to look forward to during the cold winter months when there was nothing else going on. To have all our celebrations, which we do in Australia, in summer means you've got summer going on plus all this other stuff you have to do, which doesn't leave a lot of time to actually enjoy summer. And then winter comes around and I mean, it's not that cold, but it's still cold, and we have one public holiday in June. So yeah, I would really love to be able to experience a traditional Christmas one day, and also Halloween, which I don't think is mentioned in this book, but I've always wanted to experience a proper Halloween in the autumn. I'm going to skip number 8 because it's name a book written originally in your first language, and my first language is English. It's the only language I can speak, sadly. Number 9 is name a book depicting a cultural celebration that you love. So conversely to what I've just said about Little Women, I picked A Woman in Black by Madeline St. John. This is a book set in Sydney around Christmas time, and it really lovingly depicts a summer Christmas. And I think it was the first time that I'd read a book that included a Christmas that I recognised as the same type of Christmas that I have. And it's also a really fun book in general about a group of women who all work at this department store in the 1950s. Number 10 is just a general question to talk about something you wish the rest of the world understood about your country or culture. For me, I wish the rest of the world understood how isolated we really are down here. I mentioned before how culturally we are very similar to Britain mostly, and obviously we take a lot of our culture from America, and yet I'm sure there are a lot of people like me who live in Australia who have never been to Britain or America. Certainly, unless you have a lot of money, you can't really go. And it also takes a really long time to get there. Just last month, actually, there's a new plane from Qantas that is a direct flight from Perth to London, and it only takes 17 hours apparently. I met up with a friend from England when I visited Sydney last, and she was surprised by how prevalent British culture is in Australia. Our TVs basically just show British murder mystery programs and Grand Designs non-stop. We have all those shows like Antiques Roadshow and Bargain Hunt are on all the time. Quiz shows like Pointless and QI are also on, and eventually you kind of feel like you have been to Britain even when you haven't. I feel like I know it already despite never physically being there. It's kind of weird. Another thing I wish that people understood about Australia is that we are not this friendly place that people seem to think we are. And we are in terms of, you know, if you go into a shop, people ask you how you are. they'll be nice to you most of the time. We certainly have a culture of not being outwardly rude to people that you don't know, but underneath the surface we don't like difference. And I myself are not particularly different from the so-called normal Australian. I'm white with British heritage, middle class, and yet there are things that make me different. For example, I don't really drink alcohol very much. I'm vegan. I don't have any particular interest in sport. And those such simple things I found isolate me from a lot of people. I generally find that people just find it really hard to comprehend, especially the drinking thing, that a person could decide that they don't want to do something that society says that is the norm to do, if that makes sense. I mean, it is normal for people to go out and get drunk and go to clubs on a Saturday or a Friday night, and that's just something I don't want to do, and I don't care that other people do it. And I think people just seem to get astonished at the idea that you can choose to step out of society and say that thing's not for me, or I don't agree with that thing. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's my personal experience of living in Australia, at least, is that it is not very accepting of people with differences. So I can't imagine what it's like to live in this country when you have physical differences, for example, than the norm, as well as differences in the way you live your life. So that is the end of the tag. I hope that was interesting or informative in some way about Australia, and I won't tag anyone because it's kind of not relevant now, but if you want to do this tag, obviously feel free. I hope you have a great day and I will see you soon. Bye!